Okay, welcome back. So I've got an article for you now, and we can have a look at this one. So we'll have a look at the title in a second. To start with, I'm just going to show you what I meant with some of the vocabulary items. So of course, it's very likely that you know all of these words already, but this is just in case. If you do know them, we can skip over them. It could also be that you know the word, but you're not so sure of the pronunciation, which again, I can help with that. So in this case, we would then look through the vocabulary. I would ask you to read them. So for example, we have indigenous, and actually we can see that it also has a rough approximation of how it should be pronounced. Of course, this doesn't help all students because not all students are familiar with this way of showing pronunciation. So we have the word itself, indigenous. We know that it's an adjective, and we can then look at the definition. So in this case, it's of or relating to the first people to live in a place. So of course the definitions here are going to be relatively basic. So if there are any words here that do interest you, of course it would be possible to take a note of that, and you can then look it up in further detail in your own time. So as well as having the definition, we also have an example sentence. So in this case, the example sentence is Australia's indigenous peoples make up about 3% of the population. Okay, and for anyone wondering here, so peoples, we can use this word peoples. So usually we would say people, and that could be plural, but in this case, peoples is acceptable because we're talking about an indigenous group. So we can only use peoples if we're talking about a subset of people or people of a particular culture, etc. Otherwise, we would only really see people being used. So this isn't a mistake for anyone wondering. This is fine in this particular example. So Australia's indigenous peoples make up about 3% of the population. The next word here we have apply. Now we can see apply, it's a verb, to apply. We have the approximation of the word, but I pronounce it for you anyway, so apply. And we have the definition, to bring or put something into use. And the example sentence, the internship will give you the chance to apply your skills and knowledge. So we know here to bring or put something into use. So for this particular example, you're putting your skills and knowledge to use. So that's great. The next word here, this is a very popular word at the moment, and this is polyglot. So polyglot, it's a noun, and we have the approximation again, polyglot, the definition, a person who speaks several languages, and the example sentence. So American actress Natalie Portman, who was Queen Amidala for the Star Wars fans among you. Now a polyglot who speaks 7 languages, grew up in a bilingual family. So bilingual is speaking 2 languages as your mother tongue. So in this case then, she grew up speaking 2 languages at home in her family, and she went on to learn a further 5 languages, which is very impressive. Always very interesting finding out little tidbits like this. So Natalie Portman is actually a polyglot. So now we have pieced together. I'm going to speed up now just because I just want you to have an idea of what it might look like, but this part would probably be quicker than it's coming across. So piece together, this is a phrasal verb, piece together, to bring together parts of something to make a complete whole. We often use this if we're talking about, actually the example here is pretty much the same as the one I was going to give. So police have managed to piece together the story from the accounts of several witnesses. So often if we're talking about evidence, etc., you might only have a part of something. So you want to try to piece together the individual pieces of information that you have to make the whole so that you can understand what's happened or what's going on. Okay, so we have 2 more and then we're done. So here we have the word status. It's a noun, the official legal position of a person or thing that determines their rights and responsibilities. They have finally been granted refugee status. Okay. So lingua franca, it's a noun. Again, this is going to be based on language. So we have a language used between speakers of different native languages. French remains a lingua franca in many parts of Western and Central Africa. And English, for example, a lot of people would consider English to be the lingua franca of the world. So quite interesting also. Now we're going to go down to the actual article, and this is where usually I would get you to read. So in this case, it might be a bit difficult for me to get you to read because I wouldn't necessarily be able to hear what you're saying. So I'm going to read it for you in this case. But if you were to have a lesson with me, for example, I would let you read this first, of course, and I would always prefer if my students could read aloud. Of course, there's no pressure, you don't have to, but it's something that's very, very helpful for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So just to recap very, very quickly, vocabulary, speech, actually just getting used to speaking some more. Although you're reading, because you're reading aloud, you're using the words, you're able to think about the words, you're concentrating on the pronunciation, and it builds up confidence as well, which is great. So now we're going to jump down to the article. So I'll be back again in a second. And now we're at the article. So the name of the article is going to be Google Translate adds 24 languages, including Quechua. Okay, so this one would be quite a lot of fun, for example, because sometimes we have articles where, of course, they could be about something very specific, and usually it's people's names. Actually, if we're focusing on articles, they can be from all different parts of the world, and sometimes people have very difficult names to pronounce. For me too, because if you're not familiar with the country in which they come from, or the language spoken there, it can be incredibly difficult to read people's surnames, for example. So often we have researchers mentioned in certain articles, and it can be difficult reading their names, but of course that's not so important. It's the name of a person or a person's name, and we can pronounce those how we like. But here, so this particular language is pronounced Quechua. So, like I mentioned, you would be reading this, but I will read it for you this time. About 10 million people speak Quechua, but trying to automatically translate text into the most widely spoken indigenous language family in the Americas has been nearly impossible. That changed on May the 11th, when Google added 24 languages, including Quechua, to Google Translate. The company says it has been able to expand its range of languages thanks to new artificial intelligence (AI) technology. The technology works by training an AI system in about 100 data-rich languages. The system then applies what it has learned to hundreds of other languages it doesn't know. Imagine you're some big polyglot and then you just start reading novels in another language. You can start to piece together what it could mean based on your knowledge of language in general, Google research scientist Isaac Haswell explained. Other new languages added to Google Translate include smaller languages like Mizo, spoken in northeastern India by about 800,000 people, and more widely used languages such as Lingala, spoken by around 45 million people across Central Africa. Google said its products now support 133 languages. In its announcement, Google said that the quality of translations in the newly added languages is not as good as other languages it supports. However, the company only added languages if its AI systems met a certain performance standard, Caswell said. The added languages won't yet be understood by Google's voice assistant, and the company said it is working on adding speech recognition and other features. Google's decision to add Quechua is a victory for language activists like Louis, and this is a very good example of what I mentioned earlier. I do not know how to pronounce the surname. I'm just going to go with Ile Kankwi, who created the website Quechua 2.0, which includes dictionaries and resources for learning Quechua. Ile Kankwi, who is from Peru, said having Quechua in Google Translate will help give it the same status as Spanish and help keep it alive with the next generation. Quechua was the lingua franca of the Inca Empire, which stretched from what is now southern Colombia to central Chile. After the Spanish invaded Peru more than 400 years ago, Quechua was spoken less and less. Okay, so that's going to be it for the actual article. And so this is just so you get a feeling. Of course, articles are always going to be different. I like to try to match articles to my students. So of course, the better I know someone, the better I can do that. This is a nice general article. It's about languages, and most people that are learning English are interested in languages, at least one English, and of course they have a native tongue of their own, a native language that they speak. A lot of people actually speak more than one language um, before starting English, which is very impressive. I think the world is growing more and more into this, I don't know, this like giant hot pot of polyglots from different countries, and of course the languages that they know are going to be related to native tongue in most cases, and it makes the world a much more interesting place, I think. Okay, so now that we've looked at the article, we looked at the vocabulary, so the vocabulary that we looked at was all included in the article, and that's why it's there to start with, so that when you do come across it, maybe you can remember from the beginning what it means in case it was a new word for you. So now that we've looked at the vocabulary, we've looked at the article, I'm going to ask you some questions about the article. So let's get going with that, shall we? Hello everyone, so welcome back. Now we're going to look at the questions, and the questions are obviously always going to be different. It's going to depend on what the article is about, etc. Sometimes you have questions that are related directly to the article, checking comprehension, so we call them comprehension questions. For example, if the article stated somewhere that the point of a study was to find out X, you would then have to recall that information, as you would have hopefully not only read it, but also processed that information at the same time. Because sometimes when we're reading through something, especially like an article, which might be not necessarily long in length, but it has a lot of information that you're trying to take in, it's very, very easy to end up concentrating more on your pronunciation, etc., which is good. We want to work on that. But it's what gives away your level a bit. So if you're able to pronounce things accurately while still absorbing the information that's being passed on through the article, that bodes very well for you. That shows that your level of English is probably quite high. So this isn't a bad thing. If you're not able to do that, that's no problem at all. That's why we'd be doing something like this. So with time, you get better and better at doing that, until you get to the point where it's second nature. You're already absorbing everything that you're reading and processing and understanding it, so that when you do get asked a question about it, you'll be able to remember that information, or to be able to summarize what the article was about, etc. So some questions, for example, about this particular article. So as you'll see, you can no longer see the actual article, and this is something I like to do, where I will stop sharing my screen and then I will ask the questions, because of course if the screen is still visible, the article on the screen is still visible, it's possible that you could then read the information again to answer the questions, which is also fine if that's something you like to do, but that's a different technique or a different method. So I really like to check comprehension, and because it's comprehension that you'd mostly get in various exams, IELTS, etc., for example. So you'd get asked questions about the article or the information that you've read, and yeah, so if you're able to do that quickly, of course that's going to give you a bit of an edge. So the first question about this particular article is going to be a very generic question, and that's, what are your thoughts on Google adding 24 languages to Google Translate? So again, a very open question, and this is because it fosters conversation. So of course you could say something like, I think it's good, which is perfectly fine. But this type of question, it gives you a lot of opportunity to really go into depth and explain why you think it's a good thing. If you don't think it's a good thing, why not, etc. So here you can see how we can start building up some conversation, which is key. So the more you converse, the more easily it will become for you to do that. So, of course, there's no time limit per question. Very much depends on how much you would like to talk. And obviously, it depends on how long the lesson is. If it's a very short lesson, we can't go too in depth on each question unless it's something that you'd like to do over more than one lesson, which in that case we probably could do. So the second question is, do you ever use Google Translate? If so, how accurate do you find it? This is really going to depend on the language that you're using it for. In the article, as I'm sure you probably noticed, it did mention that the new editions, so the new languages that they added, they aren't as accurate as the previous languages that can already be found on Google Translate. Again, this isn't really such a bad thing. Of course, it's not optimal, but it's better than not having the languages there at all. So it's still going to be useful for the people that would like to translate between those languages. So this is something I'm familiar with. So certain languages are really, really good with Google Translate. German, for example, when I first started learning German, it wasn't so good. It was okay. It was still very good. But in terms of grammar, it maybe wasn't 100%. Now it's really good. I mean, some of the constructions, etc., that it will give you are very, very good. Whereas languages like Finnish, if you ever translate something from Finnish on Google Translate, you have to be incredibly careful because it's not quite on the same level as the other languages. Okay, so most people probably would have used Google Translate. So you can think about how you would answer this question. So if you use it, how accurate did you or do you find it? And what language do you use it for? Is it maybe a European language? Is it a language with a different alphabet, a different script even? These would all play important roles in determining how effective the translation is going to be. So, what would you say the most difficult thing about translating between your native language and English is? So again, we can look at some of the things I mentioned for the previous question. Those are, does your language, your native language, use a different script, a different alphabet? Do you pronounce every letter in a word, or are there lots of diphthongs? Lots of things to consider. So how would you answer that question? Okay, so do you think you would enjoy work as a translator? So we have to remember the difference between a translator and an interpreter. And this is specifically asking about work as a translator. So do you think you would enjoy it? Why? Why not? I personally think it could be a lot of fun. It's actually something that I would like to go into a little bit more in depth later on. So who knows, maybe in the future I'll be doing videos about translation as well. Okay, and this will be the fifth question for the first part of the discussion, and this is a good question. So this particular question is asking, what do you imagine? So what do you imagine machine translation will be like 50 years from now? So if we imagine how far technology has come in the last 50 years, I think this gives us quite a good idea of how good machine translation could be with another 50 years. But that being said, I do not think it's going to replace people, because we as people, we are able to understand humor, sarcasm, etc. And these could be a little bit tricky for machines to understand. Um, Not a given, I'm sure. Very very clever programmers, etc., out there that could work on that. But let's be honest, even certain people don't understand humor or sarcasm quite as well as other people. Um, so it would be a very, very difficult task to create something that could, an AI source that could create really good translations if we're using sarcasm, humor, or emotion in general. Okay, so now this one's got some further discussion. So some further discussion just means probably again another 5 questions or so, and these will just be quite generic, so quite general questions where again it gives you the opportunity to converse, and maybe tell me a bit more about you specifically, about your circle. So the first question here is going to be, do you know anyone who is a polyglot? So if you remember the definition from polyglot, it's someone that speaks several languages. So like I mentioned earlier, the definitions given at the beginning here are usually quite basic. So depending on the dictionary that you use, a lot of dictionaries would probably say that the polyglot would be anywhere from 4+ languages. Some I've seen would say 5 languages. But this is up for debate. Um, I think most people would understand polyglot, someone that speaks several languages. Okay, so do you know anyone who is a polyglot? Maybe you are a polyglot. Maybe English isn't your um, isn't the second language you're learning, first language, etc. Maybe it's your fifth or sixth language already, which is very impressive. So congratulations if you're one of those people. Of course, it's impressive learning another language in general. So even if this is your first foreign language or your first second language, it's incredibly good of you to do that. And I wish you every success. And hopefully you get the bug and you continue. So, um, if you do then speak your native tongue as well as English, or maybe another language, what would you say is the best thing about being able to speak 2 languages? I'm sure you probably have some interesting stories to tell about uh, I don't know, a situation with a false friend where sometimes a word means one thing in one language and a very different thing in another language. Usually quite harmless, but sometimes there can be some very interesting differences. To give you an example, the word digger in English. So a digger is a large vehicle that digs. So it digs holes. In German, the word for digger is Bagger. And this is very funny for me because the word Bagger um, is actually a word that's used as a bit of an insult. Um, it doesn't have to be such a serious word, but let's say you've forgotten to do something, you could even say like, "Oh, bugger, um, I've not done that. I was supposed to send this letter before the end of the week." So, of course, the difference is quite stark there. And if you imagine someone in England pointing to a digger and saying bugger, and the people surrounding it just hear the word, maybe they might think that you're calling them that, which could also be quite funny. So just one example there. Okay, so what languages would you like to be fluent in? So if I'm guessing that English might be one of those languages, since you are here with me, which I appreciate. Maybe there you have another language on the go. Maybe you have a goal where in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, you're hoping to start learning another language. So that's always a very nice goal to have. So the last one here is going to be a statement. So the difference between a question and a statement would be that a question requires an answer. A statement is something that someone has said. It's not something that requires an answer. But the statement is going to be, translation is not a matter of words only. It is a matter of making intelligible a whole culture. And this statement is by Anthony Burgess. So what do you make of this statement? What are your thoughts on this statement? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? What would you say? So that's basically how one of these particular types of lessons would go. Of course, it really depends on the article. It depends on you, how you feel, your level of English, etc., etc. But this is the gist of one of these lessons. So you would then get to practice your reading, you get to practice your spoken skills, you get to hopefully improve on your vocabulary a little bit, if not directly from the article itself, then when we're talking about what's happened in the article, of course you can hear the words that I'm using as well, and maybe some of those will be new for you. So I always try to assess your level and work out what vocabulary you're familiar with, and always add one to that. So if possible, I will try to use some words that you might be able to understand from context, but might not be words that you would usually use, just so that you're able to expand your vocabulary out as well. And your pronunciation, you get to improve that. And of course, the conversation aspect. There's lots to converse about. So this is like a full workout. Very, very useful and very beneficial. So I hope you liked the video. If you did, please do like it and hopefully subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in the future. And for the rest of today, I wish you all the best. Hope to see you again soon. Take care. Bye bye for now.